This week's episode of The Amazing Nerdiverse is brought to you by The Millennial's Guide to Getting Your Shit Together, written by Katie Hogan.
Are you overwhelmed by adulthood?
Do you wish someone would teach you the difference between a 401k and a Roth IRA without using confusing industry jargon?
Do you want to learn how to ask for a raise and also keep the spice alive in your relationship?
Yeah, I think we all do.
Well, you should probably read The Millennial's Guide to Getting Your Shit Together by financial planner and comedy writer Katie Hogan.
It's a collection of humorous and informative essays on money, careers, and relationships.
It's the answer to your quarter-life crisis, and it's available now on Amazon in both Kindle and paperback form. Also, be sure to subscribe to her podcast, Get It Together with Katie Hogan, and follow her on Twitter at GetItTogether20.
And now, another fine edition of The Amazing Nerdiverse!
Yay!
Quiet, you.
Uh-huh. Hello and welcome to the Amazing Nerdiverse. I'm Jeff Grant. This is the podcast where we talk about all things good and geeky that make up the Amazing Nerdiverse. Movies, TV shows, video games, comic books. And we're going to talk about all of those today because we got a very special guest on the show this week. Paul Jenkins. He's a comic book writer, film, video games, all that stuff. He won an Eisner for the Inhumans in the 90s, the Marvel Knights run. That's like the definitive run on that title, which the new ABC show kind of adopted some of the things from that and did not do a great job of adapting such a great story. We talk a little bit about that. He wrote more issues of Hellblazer than any other writer. He created the Sentry. He wrote Wolverine Origin, the comic book, not the movie. One of my favorites, Sidekick. And he's got a new series called Alters from Aftershock Comics. I first met Paul a few years ago working on some film projects. Me and Steven had the pleasure of working with him. I was able to co-write a short film with him for a 24-hour film race. It was called Dick Jokes, which Steven starred in, and former guest Atkins and a bunch of people that we've worked with in the past. You can check that out on the Third Place Productions YouTube channel. I'll try to remember to include a link to that on the description for this episode on YouTube and on the blog. It made it into the finals of the competition for the 24-hour film race, screened in New York. Samuel L. Jackson tweeted about it. It was really cool. I used to go over to Paul's house with the Third Place production guys to work on some of these film projects. And in the downtime of shooting or writing or planning the production or whatever, we'd just be sitting around. And I'd just be like perusing his shelf of comics that he wrote. And he would just point to one and go, "Oh, you should read this one." And that's how I first read some of the like Sidekick one-shots that they did. And Captain America Theater of War, which is incredible. Paul talks about that one in this interview. Paul he's such a nice, generous guy. I've loved working with him in the past, and he's done me the favor of coming on the podcast this week, which is really cool. So we talk about his career, his early days working with Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles blew up, working with guys like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. What makes characters like John Constantine and the Inhumans so special, and he told me what he thought of like some of their film adaptations, their live action adaptations. It's really interesting to talk to him about those things. He talked to me about what it's like seeing himself as a Marvel Comics character. Brian Michael Bendis used him in his new Avengers run as a character, as the creator of the Sentry. So he talked about that, which is cool. And, we talk about his new series, Alters, which is a really interesting series and stuff. You'll hear him talk about it, where the inspiration for that came. Alters is on Aftershock Comics. You should definitely check it out. So without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Paul Jenkins. All right, so I'm here with Paul Jenkins, a Eisner Award-winning writer of comics, video games, film. Paul, thanks for being on the show today.
Happy to be here, man.
So I wanted to talk about everything, your life, your career, your work in like comics, film, TV, video games, and but I also want to talk about your new series, Alters, with Aftershock Comics. But first, let's go back to your early days. You were born in the UK, right?
Yeah.
Where'd you grow up?
Well, I grew up on a farm. I mean, I grew up in kind of an interesting environment. My dad last when I was 5. So my brother and I grew up with a single mum, and she's a really, really intelligent, clever, interesting person, very, very eccentric, and we had this unbelievable childhood where we really had nothing. I mean, we had no electricity, no money, nothing. It was pretty crazy. But we had a farm to live on, and we'd sort of walk outside and pick an apple, I suppose, if we wanted it. And it tended to make me grow up a little bit with magic. We moved to the West Country, so we moved back out to the magic again. There were castles everywhere and places you could walk to, and all of that. So it really didn't sort of seem as though you were that deprived in some ways. And when I was about 11 years old, I think I was sort of headed one way or another. I was either going in a good direction or a bad one. And I got a scholarship to a school that kind of gave me a good education. So I left home when I was about 11 and never really went back.
Oh, wow. So you studied, you got a scholarship for school. Was that when you studied acting, right?
Yeah. I went to a school. I sort of insisted that they have an acting program there. Actually, this was kind of a high school, And after that happened, I took a year off between school and college, and I had a couple of really interesting jobs. I was actually an immigration official.
Oh, wow.
Like 18 years old, and I did that for Scotland Yard, and I worked a little bit with the anti-terrorist squad. It's crazy, right?
Wow, yeah.
And I went off to study to be an actor. I spent most of my time in film school, and I thought that would actually be my profession, would be filmmaker and all of that. But then I came over to the United States, and I was teaching music and drama to learning disabled children in Pennsylvania. And I happened to go to Massachusetts, and I met the guys that created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So I ended up doing that instead.
Wow, yeah. So were you writing it during this time as well?
No, not really. I was playing music. I still do it. I was playing in a band and trying to kind of make my way. And I thought that might be a path for me. I thought that acting might be a path for me, but ultimately I ran into this, sort of slap bang into this incredible opportunity, and I did that instead.
Yeah. Did you read comics at all growing up? Was that ever a part of your life?
The answer to that is yes and no. I think it's really interesting, actually, and it's part of one of the things that's really been an advantage for me. No, I didn't really read comics because we didn't have any money, so I couldn't afford them.
Yeah.
We would very, very occasionally get some comics. My mum would try to get us some. My grandmother would send us a few in a little rolled-up paper tube that we would get once a month. And they were really interesting comics because they would be like a few British comics. And we really looked forward to getting those comics because it was one of the few things that we could get, my brother and I. Yeah. They would have some reprints of American comics. So we would get occasionally Spider-Man or Daredevil. Those were the two that we would get. Yeah. We didn't have a television. So we didn't consume pop culture. It was really weird. All of our friends, their parents were all married. We didn't consume any of that culture. But the first comic that really struck me was when I was about 7 or 8, and I got a black and white reprint of the old EC comics from the 50s. Oh, wow. And it was science fiction comics and the Uncanny Tales. So I kind of like Spider-Man okay and Daredevil was okay, but I really loved like the Uncanny Tales and all the amazing science fiction, science fantasy, and all that kind of stuff. That stuff really struck me, and it had stories in that I remember really well, and maybe that shaped me a little bit, as a writer.
Yeah. So you said you first started with the guys at Mirage, Eastman and Laird. You were there when TMNT blew up. What was that like? Watching that, being a part of that, and as a learning experience?
Yeah, I think it just depends on who you are and what kind of person you are anyway. The thing that I learned was that having not come from money, I didn't distrust money, but I did see that a massive pile of money tended to expose the weakest parts of a person's personality. Yeah. And so we were inundated with people that claimed they created the Ninja Turtles, and we had people working around us that were really kind of unpleasant, and people just ripping off the creators, and just horrible stuff. Things that I didn't really care for. It wasn't my life, and it wasn't my money, and I never expected it to be. So I never angled for any of this money. I think, it's interesting. I've remained really good friends with Kevin Eastman, and I love the man. He's a great guy, and I remember having a conversation with him once. It was very early on, and I was very, very young. You have to understand, when I was working with Ninja Turtles and then subsequently doing Tundra Publishing, I ended up being a director of Tundra. I think I was 24 when I was crazy. I was 22 when I started working with Ninja Turtles, Yeah. And I had a conversation with Kevin one time, and you know what it was? It was to do with a Christmas bonus that they had worked out, and I didn't feel comfortable with it. I got to be honest. And I went to see Kevin, and I said, "Look, man, I'll tell you what. I know I'm young. We were all quite young, but I said what I see is that you have friends that haven't been friends to you because they see the money and they think it's fallen out of your pocket. So my feeling on this is, if we're going to remain friends, I don't know if that money should get in the way a little bit,
Yeah.
I think it's not for me. It's not. I'd rather do Tundra Publishing than do Mirage in some ways, because Mirage is where all the money is, but Tundra was a publishing endeavor. I think I'd rather do that because at that point, money won't get in the way of our relationship. And you know what? We remain great friends even to this day. He got remarried a couple of years ago, and I sang at his wedding. So
wow.
That was a good choice, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said you started working for Tundra. Is that where you were editor? You were editor at that time, or?
Yeah. I was an editor at Mirage a little bit, but I was much an editor. I was the editor-in-chief at Tundra.
Okay.
And I went to go to be the editor-in-chief of a very short-lived company called Majestic. So yeah, I primarily was an editor there. It was a great time. It was amongst the people that I edited, I had Neil Gaiman, I had Alan Moore,
wow.
I had Dave McKean, and these were all people that I spoke to regularly and worked with, and they were great. And Neil's a great dude, right? Alan is really quirky, and he's not I don't think really Alan is the way that people think he is. I think that's a bit of a public persona.
Yeah.
But it's funny, I would call him all the time. I was the editor on Big Numbers. So I don't know if you know what Big Numbers is, but it's like the famous unpublished sort of Kubla Khan of Alan Moore. The art was by Bill Sienkiewicz.
Okay.
And number 3 never got published.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. Number 4 was destroyed. And so that was an interesting time. But I would call Alan, and every time I'd sort of call him up and go, "Hello, Alan, it's Paul." And he'd go, every single time he'd go, "Hello, Paul, all right, mate?" So we dropped out of touch for a few years, but I needed to call him up about something. And so I called him up and I said, Alan, it's Paul Jenkins. I haven't spoken to you ages. And he went, "Hello, Paul. All right, mate?" He didn't even miss a beat.
Every time.
Great guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really
So I imagine you learned a lot working with those guys as well, like people like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. You eventually started writing stuff as well. What was the first thing you wrote?
Well, here's the interesting thing. So, yes, I learned a lot from all of those people. Mm-hmm. I would get great scripts and be able to kind of work on them and understand them. And one of the first things that I learned as an editor, and it was perhaps one of the best traits I had as an editor, was when not to edit. I mean, most of the time you're not editing Neil, or we didn't really have to edit Neil anyway because we had existing materials from him. But with Alan, it's not like I'm going to call him up and say, "Alan this, Alan that," right? But then again, he wasn't close to it, and so on occasion I would point out something, and a couple of times I'd find a continuity mistake, and he'd say, "Great, thanks, Paul," or he would say, "No, that's okay, I've got that covered," sort of thing. So, and he usually had it covered. But here's the thing: I wanted to be a writer, and so this is one of the things I do with young people. I sort of try to explain that talent doesn't really exist, right? I don't think there's anything as talent. I think that talent is potential. And I think it only becomes talent when you add hard work and social maturity. Put those two things onto talent, you have talent. Otherwise it's just potential. Mm-hmm. So I had a bleeding stomach ulcer at the age of 24. I was so stressed out.
Wow.
I was doing Big Numbers. Kevin had bought a recording studio in Maine, acoustically perfect recording studio. He had a pre-production house and put me in charge of it. So I'm 24 years old. I got a bunch of guys they're in their 50s, and I'm their boss, and that was messed up. And I was always aware of it, but being brought in, so they were very resentful. So I had all these stresses and pressures. And I had to read scripts, and I had to make books happen, and there were too many books, and some of them were a nightmare. And you know what I would do when I'd get home at night? I would sit down and I would read scripts, and I would try to write. Like, my work ethic was sort of unparalleled, I think, to some extent. Mm-hmm. And I went over to see Alan one time. This is actually the moment that I realized, you know what? I think I should try and do this. I went over to see Alan, and we were talking about big numbers, and we were sort of working out various things at his house in Northampton in England. And so I lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he lived in Northampton, England, actually. And I sat with him, and he told me some ideas he had about writing and just some thoughts. One of the thoughts that he had was that every single page of a comic book should be its own story, and it ends with its own emphasis, punchline or whatever. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's what I do. And I realized that I didn't really have bad habits, because if they were good enough for Alan Moore, they were certainly good enough for me. But I was actually, so I told him, I said, Alan, I've been sort of working at this, and I'm quite interested in doing it. And he said, well, I think you're on the right track there, Paul. And I came back, and I had left Tundra, and I went to go to work down in Cincinnati for a year. And I decided I think I should be a freelance writer. So I kind of broke in to comics as a freelance writer in exactly the way that you're not supposed to break into comics. I went down to San Diego Comic-Con, and I met the editor of Hellblazer, and I said, hi, I understand you're looking for a new writer. And he said, what have you written? And I said, I've never written anything in my life. And he and Karen Berger, like Lou Staffis, dearly departed friend and sort of mentor to me, gave me my first job. He basically said, okay, for whatever reason, they decided to read my script. And 6 weeks later, they called me up and said, well, congratulations, you're the new writer of Hellblazer. Now, little did I know that like Warren Ellis wanted to write it, and all kinds of other people wanted to do it, but they gave it to me.
Wow, yeah. And that run went for like 5 years or something, that Hellblazer run, right?
Yeah. You realize the assistant editor on that book was this young guy called Axel Alonso, who's now the editor-in-chief of Marvel. Wow.
So yeah, you worked with a lot of guys over the years and everything, just these huge names in the comic book industry. You wrote Hellblazer for a while. You were writing the character of John Constantine for about 5 years. As someone who, you obviously know the character really well if you to write for 5 years on the character and everything. As someone who knows him that well, what have you thought of like some of the adaptations of the character to film or TV, like Keanu Reeves or Matt Ryan?
How funny is it that I will probably defend the Keanu Reeves film before I defend the TV show?
Really?
That's weird, right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing: the feel and the approach of the movie, even though Keanu Reeves probably isn't the person to be John Constantine, the way that he looks, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't a bad feel. It was a story that I think you could sort of get behind, and it had an amazing androgynous Gabriel in it. Which was just, Tilda Swinton is brilliant, always. Yeah. That was brilliant.
Yeah.
But here's the thing with the TV show. I turned it on, I watched 2 minutes of it and said, I already know why this is not going to work. And what it is that John Constantine really at his core is interesting because he has no powers, he's not a superhero, and he doesn't really, what he can do is he can look the devil in the eye and the devil blinks first. Yeah. He's clever. And he does things like that. And the first thing that John Constantine would probably tell you is, don't do magic.
Yeah.
Don't do magic because you pay twice for the thing that you got, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing I do, I turn on the TV show and he's walking around the street and he's got some thing that he can kind of turn on and it's got smoke coming out of it and the smoke forms into an arrow and it points him down the road to where he wants to go. Yeah. And he's making magical incantations. And I turned it off. I'm like, that's just, there's nothing there because the thing about magic is that you must pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, if it doesn't create twice the problem that you already solved in the first place by using it, then what's the point? It's just a thing that you can do. It's just, you can do whatever you like.
It's just another superpower.
And so, myself I actually wrote more issues of Hellblazer than anyone, but myself, Alan, pick a writer, Jamie Delano, all of us would sit there and go, well, that's not what John Constantine would do, and what's the point of having him do that? If he doesn't pay for it, it's not interesting. Mm-hmm. So I frankly hated it.
Wow. Yes. Did you not like the actor in the role? Because you were saying Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, Matty Ryan looked like John Constantine. That's exactly who I would like to have as John Constantine. It makes no difference really, because there's sort of an old way of looking at it. If you had a comic book, and the comic book had great art and a poor story, or you had another comic book that had great story and poor art, I think you're only going to remember the one with a great story. You're never going to remember the other one. Yeah. Sure. So it had the right person in the role and the wrong story immediately. They broke it immediately.
Yeah. So were you writing other stuff at this time during this period of Hellblazer as well?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I was doing some books of magic stuff, and I was sort of like trying to work out where I would go with it. And it's funny because I had been talking with Jay Lee, who was doing Hellshock at the time. Actually, and it wasn't even myself or Jay. It was someone else who sort of said, you guys should do a Hellshock Hellblazer crossover. And so we would call each other periodically, and I'd say, you got any ideas? And Jay would say, no, I had no idea. I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, what are we going to do? We knew that we wanted to work together, but we didn't know what to do because it just never went anywhere. Yeah. And one day I get this phone call from him, and this is the part that always kind of upsets people to some extent. I get this phone call from Jay, and he says, hey, I got a call from Joe and Jimmy. I said, Joe and Jimmy used to have Event Comics, Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. They had Event Comics, and they had called Jay and said, we're going to go work at Marvel, do this thing called Marvel Nights. Are you interested? And Jay said, yeah, that sounds all right, Well, who do you want to work with? They said, and he said, I want to work with Paul Jenkins. What do you want to do? Well, I want to do the Inhumans. Okay, great. Give him a call. So Jay calls me up and says, you want to do the Inhumans? I said, yeah, great. Who are they? Because the problem is, I don't read comics. I don't know anything about them. And this is the weird thing. I mean, I've done this in interviews before, but it kind of frustrates fans to some extent, and I feel like it shouldn't. Yeah. You have to understand that it gives me a tremendous advantage because I'm not stuck in every issue of Daredevil that's ever been written. I just write, I think, works for Daredevil. So Jay says who they are, and I remember the dog with a tuning fork on his head, funnily enough, and I thought, oh yeah, and the lady with hair that punches people, that's great. So they send me these couple of Jack Kirby stories, and there were 2 5-page stories, and I called him up and said, do me a favor, don't send me anymore, I get it, I can do this is great. So I made this big pitch, and it was kind of a funny time, that Marvel were not convinced. They were in such a bad place, and they were not convinced that Inhumans would last very long. Mm-hmm. I was told, actually, like, it may only go 1 issue. And we came out with the first book, and people were quite interested in it. And they quite liked it, and that was okay. And then issue 2 came out, and it was like the universe exploded. Yeah. This is the greatest book of all time. And we sort of said, it's just another comic book, isn't it? But they loved it.
That's crazy because you're saying, like, not knowing anything about them. You read 2 5-page stories and everything, but your run on Inhumans with Jay Lee, it ended up being like the definitive story for the Inhumans. I feel like whenever Inhumans come up, everyone always points to that run and goes, "This is what Inhumans are." Like, I just reread it and everything.
Yeah, not only that, but they used it for their TV show, didn't they? So they enjoyed the hell out of it.
Yeah. They used stuff from the TV show. Have you seen anything about the TV show?
I don't care about it. I don't watch it. I don't care. I really don't.
I've watched it and I really dislike it. Like, especially right after I was rereading your book and everything for this interview, and also because Inhumans, and I was just like, wow, they so missed the mark.
Yeah, the review I got, all the reviews I've seen have been basically they tried to do our book, they didn't do a very good job, and it's just like that Constantine thing I was telling you about, right? Mm. So the thing with him is he would never use magic, so why put that on your TV show? Yeah. And here's the thing about Black Bolt, especially, that I feel sort of proud that Jay and I did that other people didn't do. Here he is. I thought the Inhumans were such a metaphor for American society because at its core, you had and this was back in the day, right? Because it's obviously not as pertinent now.
Yeah.
You had a leader who could not speak his mind. Obviously, that's not the case anymore.
No.
But in those days, we were looking at things that you really can't speak your mind because you would create a constitutional crisis, wouldn't you? You can't really say, I hate this guy because it creates a problem. And in fact, I think we're kind of seeing a little bit of that right now. When someone speaks their mind as a leader, you've got to be very careful what you say. Yeah. And I realized that these children would get into the Terrigen Mist and they would change. And I thought, well, that's puberty.
Yeah.
And I realized that these creatures under the substructure that we called it, these alpha primitives, they were very much a metaphor for sort of emancipated Black America. This was America we were writing about, and look at all this melting pot. And so what we did was we wrote about it as sort of like a power-based society. Again, this is, I think, what they use on the TV show. Here's the power-based society. If you've got this power, you're in the royal guard or you're the king. If you've got a crappy power, you live in the crappy end of town. You don't get much, right? And so that felt very much like if you have privilege, you're okay. If you don't have privilege, you're not okay. And that's very American, and it's just the way it is. And the thing that I'm so proud of is that Black Bolt, by his very nature, is not supposed to speak, right? I mean, he can't say anything because his voice is so powerful that stuff blows up and he break the world in half.
Yeah.
And I found that virtually every writer that had written him up to me had him lean out the front window and say, go away, and then everything blows up. And I thought, what you've done is you've done the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do with that character. The tension in him is that he can't speak and he doesn't speak.
Yeah.
So we all these scenes about like him meditating at night so that he wouldn't talk in his sleep.
Yeah.
And then he had sign language and all this other kind of stuff. And there was a way that he was, but he couldn't speak. And he never did speak. So what happened was when the book came out, about 7 or 8 issues into it, I started seeing fan response, and it was, well, when's he going to speak? And I thought, well, you never cared about him before, did you?
Yeah.
Now you get angry and you're getting frustrated and you're wondering, why won't he walk out the front door and take on these people head on? And it's because he has a plan. But you're getting angry and you're getting frustrated and you're wondering, and I'm like, I realized we had built up tension where no one else had done. And when he solves his problem, he never does speak. He walks right in a straight line all the way to his brother, grabs his brother, and then hugs his brother and then takes him back to jail. Like that's what he should always be.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful moment too. Yeah, like in that.
And here's there's another thing that I think that they kind of made a mistake on. In my opinion, obviously, I heard that he had never been defeated in battle, and I thought, well, that was great. They've got this great Marvel character. He has never been defeated in battle. And the very next series that was done after Jay and I made that popular, they had him defeated in battle for the first time. And you thought, well, that's your only time then, isn't it? You've now had him defeated in battle for the first time. You can never say he's never been defeated in battle anymore. So all you did was erode your character. What you could have done with that character was always put him right at the point where he couldn't possibly win and then show how he wins and go, he's still undefeated. And you could always say that, right? But they blew it.
Yeah.
So,
I could talk about Inhumans all day. This is fascinating. I just love your run so much. So let's talk about a couple other things. You're not only a comic book writer, but you were also a comic book character. You created Sentry, and then Brian Michael Bendis used Sentry in New Avengers, and he introduced you as a character in that. What was that like?
It was very meta, wasn't it? The thing about the Sentry was that I had created the Sentry many years before I started writing at Marvel, and I had pitched it to Marvel and pitched it to DC, and it was basically the Beatles. They said no, and so I didn't think that was ever going to get done. And then I came in and did the Inhumans, and they said, okay, you can do anything that you want to do.
Yeah.
That's Spider-Man. Jay and I could have picked our book at that point, and I said, I want to do the Sentry. And they moaned and carried on like, not that stupid bloody thing. You've aimed that one in our direction. And I said, I promise you that the Sentry is going to be great. I promise it's like a Superman that you don't have. He's so Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. He is his own worst enemy. He has an affliction. He has disorganized type schizophrenia with agoraphobia. He's this thing. He's the guy in the wheelchair or the guy who's blind, right? But his is a mental illness, and he's Superman. Isn't this so Marvel? And they said, great, okay. So they did it, and a couple of years later, Brian told me that he was sort of sitting around, and someone in a meeting said, there have been no good characters created in the last whatever, and he said, what's wrong with you? There's this, there's that. I did Jessica Jones or whatever. Here's the Sentry. And so they said, okay, great. Then, and he said, let's put him in the Avengers. Like, why don't we build them up? And he was right about it. So he puts him in, and he calls me up and says, I got this really kind of weird scene. Are you up for it? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. So I signed more copies of that bloody book where I'm the Sentry's creator. The Sentry meets him in the comic.
Yeah.
Found out I belong to Marvel. I'm actually a character that belongs to them, which is funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was interesting because you don't see that all. I mean, you see that every now and then and stuff, but not a whole lot. Like that's a rare thing.
I did think it was funny that when I meet the Sentry, I faint, and he has me speaking like Dick Van Dyke. Like all Americans think that all British people speak like Dick Van Dyke. So, oh blimey, oh no, and goes no and falls over. I'm like, thanks, Brian. I appreciate the vote of confidence there.
Just touching on a couple things that you've done that I like. Sidekick, I love. You're wearing the Sidekick hat, right?
I have got a Sidekick hat on, have I?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, excellent.
I've told you how much I love that comic. It's just hilarious, and
that's my happiest thing in comics. The amount of money that bloody book has cost me, right? Yeah. But I love Sidekick, and it's funny, and it's fun, and totally irreverent. And there's actually about 120 characters that you've never seen. There's this big, massive characters that are so funny. Chris Marino is a genius. He's now an art director at Disney. Mm-hmm. And Chris is my favorite person in this business, and he's brilliant, and he's a great friend, and he gets me. Right? He understands. And one night we had this funny series of emails, and we said, we should just make up stupid heroes and villains. And so we made up all these groups. One of them was the Council of American Superheroes, because we like acronyms. So the Council of American Superheroes, the acronym is CASH. And so we said it was a non-profit organization, all checks back, all the cash. Then we had the Superheroes in Training. So obviously theirs was shit. We had Supervillain Training Department, which was STD, and they would sort of point at the superheroes and say, haha, you're funny, and they say, well, your acronym's STD, and they go, oh, all right. And then finally we had the League of Dicks, which was the bad guys.
Yeah.
And the League of Dicks was demented and insane criminals, killers, and sickos, right? We had all these characters, and so we said, let's just put names, we'll throw them out there. And we threw out the dumbest names we could think of. The Sherpa, right? Like, who's got the worst powers, right? Lard Lad, that was a good one. Hyperactive Girl, the Caffeine Teen, right? And so I don't realize this, but Chris has drawn every single one of the ones that was in that thread. It's so I get this email and it's got 120 drawings in it. I drew them all, said Chris. Now I write descriptions for them, and they're literally the funniest thing. They are like my favorite thing. And what happens is when I get my phone out and I show them to people, and I show them some of these characters, they like.
You've actually showed me a couple of them before.
I've shown you a couple of these things, and people can't believe it. Like, where are these? I want these.
Yeah.
Grocknar, Violator of Sheep, is actually my favorite because I'm Welsh. So
Yeah. I remember that one. Yeah, you showed me that guy. It's fantastic. You should. Yeah, like you said, everyone says it, but I'm going to say it too. I would love to see you release something with all of those character things and everything.
We've talked about it. So Sidekick still sort of sits there, and we'll do some ancillary of him. I always think that the funniest thing that we could do would be to make up all those characters as little vinyl characters and do that as well. That would be fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, Sidekick. That's points for you.
Yeah. So another thing I love, Mythos. You did like the retelling of the origin stories. What is it about like some of these origin stories that you think captures people's imaginations, that they retell them over and over? And what was it like for you artistically to kind of take the story that's been told before but put it through your prism?
So that is actually the hardest job that I've ever done in my career.
Really?
Mythos, yeah, because what they did was they said to me, We want you to take the origin stories, which are really problematic because they're usually 7 pages. In 7 pages of amazing fantasy, Spider-Man is a kid. He gets bitten by a radioactive spider. His Uncle Ben gets killed. He goes and tracks down the bad guy and ends up being Spider-Man, fashions his suit, all in like 7 pages. Yeah. About 19 panels on each page. You know, he did this, right? So that's quite a problematic kind of thing to recreate.
Yeah.
And at the time, they said, you know, look, we want to get the pop culture version, which is the movie. We want to mix it with the actual version. Mm-hmm. So you've got the way that people see it in the public eye. You've got that kind of updated, so it fits that. But at the same time, can you give them your voice and a unique kind of slant? Yeah, that's easy, right? I've got like 9 things I have to do. But I will say it is the hardest job and one of the most satisfying jobs I've ever done. Mm-hmm. So a good example of it would be this. To give them a new slant, for example, to give them some reason for being is very hard. Because I don't want to be, I'm not rewriting the history. I didn't create these characters, so why should I, right? Yeah. And at one point, you know, I had the Fantastic Four, and here's this origin. They go to space, they get bombarded with space rays, they come back, they got crazy powers. And here's the movie, and I don't know if that movie was so great, but here it is. That's what people know the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
So my origin story was literally them sitting in front of Congress, and they've just come back, and they've just got these powers. And they're sitting in front of Congress, and people in Congress are saying, how do we know you're not a danger? And Reed Richards is saying, I'm an American citizen, so unless I've done something, you know. Yeah. But you have this congressional inquiry, and at one point, the congresswoman says to them, well, what were you thinking when your ship got bombarded with space rays? And Reed Richards says, you know, I was desperately trying to reach out for my wife. And she says, I was hiding. I was trying to make sure I was okay. And Ben Grimm says that, you know, he just pulled the door off and he's reaching out, trying to grab Johnny and pull him in. And Johnny Storm says, I was hot. So in other words, what they were thinking is what gave them their power.
Yeah.
At the time, and this hadn't really been done. And so I thought this was a unique slant. And we had done this with plenty of it. You know, my favorite, all of those mythos was Captain America. And my favorite stuff I ever wrote for Marvel was the Captain America Theater of War books.
I love that. But you let me read it over at your house one time. It's a fantastic story.
Those are my favorites. And the Mythos one was good too. And the reason I think it was quite good was when you look at Captain America, what was so interesting about him was that he was a small, skinny guy who was rejected for military service, but he wanted to serve. And I thought to myself, you know, like, why? Why would he? So I did a bit of research and realized time-wise, he would have been born and raised during and after the Great Depression. And so because he never knew his father and because his mother dies when he's very young, and he's a kid that's bullied and he's a reader and all this kind of stuff that's in the actual origin, I wanted to give him a reason for joining. And the reason he joined is because he wanted to honor the father that he never knew.
Yeah.
And so that is a great... And so I wrote that mythos story, and it follows the exploits of this guy. And the kid that bullies him on page 1 of Captain America, the kid that has that, what do you call it, a catapult and is like firing at him in the street when trying to read a book, that same kid ends up joining it up with him and then being in the same regiment as him. And it's his father's regiment, the Blue Spaders, 17th Infantry. And then he goes to war and the kid ends up getting shot at, and then he pins a medal on him, and then he goes to the regiment, and in the end that kid is the only one left of the regiment. And so it's a story about brotherhood and love, and that's what happened. He knew that all of these men were not invulnerable, and he was. And so his love for his fellow soldier was unparalleled, and that's what makes him a patriot. And it's funny that in that Captain America stuff, my favorite, I don't like positive or negative reviews, so I don't really care. But I did have a positive review of that book, and it was my favorite ever review. And it took a British guy and an Italian who was the artist to teach me the true meaning of American patriotism. Wow. And I thought, wow, that makes me happy.
Yeah, that's a great quote. So, like you said, you wrote all these Marvel characters and stuff. You've also written for like Constantine and Batman and Dredd and Wolverine. So many great characters. Are there any characters that you haven't had a chance to work with yet that you've always wanted to kind of work with a little bit?
Well, you mentioned one that I haven't written that I probably would do. Yeah, Judge Dredd. I've never written him.
Oh, you never read Judge Dredd?
No. So that would be one. But that being said, my answers are really boring and somewhat predictable if you know me, which is I don't really care about what character. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I might be the only idiot that was sort of asked for three years or so, hey, would you be interested in writing Spider-Man? And sort of said, I don't even know what to do. I'm like confused by it. And after turning it down for 3 years, I finally talked to Ralph Macchio, who was the editor, and I said, I think I've got it, Ralph. And he said, great. And I gave him a pitch, and he said, okay, let's bring you in. So it worked out in the end.
Where did I get that? Just I think it was something on Wikipedia.
I think it's the assumption that being a Brit, like me, Garth Ennis, Grant Morrison, Alan, we would all have gone through 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, right? But I'm the one that didn't.
Really? My bad. Sorry about that.
Certainly.
So what is your process when do you come up with ideas for the characters and pitch them and stuff, or is you give an assignment or something like that? Is it like random bits and pieces of stuff pop in your head and go, oh, I can use that for this character and just kind of file it away, or do you just sit down and go, what story am I telling with this character?
I think he just kind of did the Harlan Ellison thing where they say, where do you get your ideas from? And the answer is, I got this mail order catalog that I get from Cleveland, Yeah. It's Harlan's answer. I think it's a really good one. Okay, so it's complicated, but it's not complicated, right? The first thing I do is I sort of say, I'm not writing any story that doesn't deserve to exist. Mm-hmm. So I would say to any of my students or whatever, tell me why. You tell me why that thing deserves to exist, and I'm in. But if you don't tell me why, and if you can't tell me why, and here's the thing, you like robots is not a reason for that to exist. Mm-hmm. But this is a story about how it feels to lose a parent or family member to Alzheimer's. Then I get that, and we'll go with that, right?
Yeah.
So generally, I would look at characters and say, well, these things are a metaphor for something. Like, what was my approach to heroism, and what was my approach to Spider-Man, for example? I think Spider-Man is the guy who wakes up and he's got the flu, and he gets in the shower and he takes a shower and he sort of barely sees his wife and his two children, and he feels terrible and he doesn't remember to have breakfast, drives 2 hours to work, gets there 2 minutes late, his boss yells at him, he's still got the flu, he has a terrible day, gets back in traffic, arrives home at 8:30 at night, his spouse is upset, his kids are in bed, dinner's in the cat, and he's kind of like, okay, fine, and he kind of goes to the fridge, gets some baked beans, eats them, and goes to bed and gets up and does it all over again. That's a hero, right? Male or female. I mean, it could be a mum that does it, but that's not the point. It's more like that. Or when you go to war, if you go to war and you're terrified that you'll never see your wife and children again, that's a hero. Those are the real people, right? So jumping into battle with a stogie in your mouth and a machine gun doesn't, that you're not afraid. You're a lunatic, right? And I think if you can approach it that way, and you approach it in terms of what do we see, one of the first things that happened with Spider-Man was I called Mark Buckingham up, who was the artist on it, and I said, Mark, what do you think? And he agreed with me. What happened to Spider-Man that we read when we were kids? I remember that Spider-Man used to win because he had a sense of humor and Dr. Octopus didn't. So it didn't matter who punched who first and who punched who hardest. He would face off with Dr. Octopus and he would crack a joke and it would piss off Dr. Octopus so badly that we were like, woohoo, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, all this navel gazing, why isn't it funny? Why can't it be funny? Mm-hmm. And it should be funny. So we decided to make it funny. And I remember it is one of my favorite phone calls of my career. Is calling Mark. It's 4:00 in the morning here. He's in Britain, so it's 9 a.m. He's having his cup of tea. I'm getting ready to go to bed. And we start talking about what stories we're going to do. And we decide we're going to have Spider-Man fight a gang of mimes. And this goes nuts. This conversation goes off the rail in a second. We decide we're going to fight a gang of mimes, and now we've got all these crazy jokes, like, I know it'd be really funny, what if, you point two fingers at them and they put their hands up? That would be funny, right? And then we had all these crazy things. Oh, I know what we should do. We should have the Mind Mobile. It should be a VW Bug. That's funny. Let's do it, right? So we said yes to anything that was funny. And we started putting it in, and we heard, oh, you cannot, you can't make Spider-Man funny. Yeah, no, I should say you can't make Spider-Man interesting anymore. And I think that we disproved it with our very first issue. It was fun, and it was funny, and I think all the fans said, wow, we got Spider-Man back finally. We've been waiting for that. Nice. So, you know, where do they come from? They come from all kinds of places, but at their core, they're human stories about you and me. I write about things that I see and I know for an audience.
That's awesome. Okay, so a couple more things. I definitely want to talk about alters, but first, real quick, let's talk about video games. You've written for a couple of video games, the Darkness, Mafia 2, Incredible Hulk. What's that like? That process? How's it different from comics? Is it like stretching a different muscle?
Yeah, well, you know, for me, in my career, what I did was sort of innovate. I mean, I think, you know, if you go back to when I started, I was lucky enough to work on a few games where I came in at a time where the industry was sort of in chaos, right? Because in those days, people within the industry would say, we can't really do stories in video games. And it seems absurd now, but at that time there was, how do we make stories out of video games? Can't be done. So anyone that knows me knows that there's one thing that I'm like Marty McFly about. If you remember Marty McFly used to say to me, you chicken, and he would always turn and come back at you, right? Yeah. So with me, it's, if you tell me it can't be done, right, I will go off and do it.
Yeah.
And I gave a speech at Kansas State University last year, at the beginning of the year, and that speech was, here are the things that you cannot do. You cannot grow up in a poor single-parent household, come to America, you can't be part of the Ninja Turtles, you can't write comic books, you can't edit Alan Moore, and I gave this list of things that you cannot do, and then said, I've done every single one of those things. So don't tell me what I can't do, because you can, and I've done it. Video games then were seen as being dumb entertainment for dumb children, just like comics were, and I said, that's it, I'm taking up the mantle. And I was lucky enough to meet and work with a few amazing people like Amy Hennig, who was the head, the sort of game director, I suppose, of story at Crystal Dynamics. So I worked on Soul Reaver with her. So Soul Reaver is this crazy game that's all about Gnosticism. Amy and I had these massive headaches trying to work out how story can actually work in video games. And this is back in the day, man. This is when people say it can't. And we created ideas, and I thought of concepts, and I brought them into the Darkness, and I brought them into all these games. Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction seems like a nutty little game, but there were things that we did that were so innovative in that game. And especially in the Darkness, which is this weird little gem that people don't realize. That game innovated in a way that no other game had. It had lots of story assets that only went to story and not to gameplay. And it's one of the most emulated games, I think, in terms of story in the business, because of some of the things that we decided to do that were first. We were first on a bunch of that stuff. So game writing is awesome, and I'm doing some right now, and can't tell you what it is, but I love doing it.
I'll be excited to hear about it when you can talk about it. Okay, so I've also, you know, like I said, I've had the opportunity to work with you a couple times on like some film projects and stuff like that. You've been doing a lot of great work in Georgia in the film industry. You want to talk a little bit about what you've been doing with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? So the one thing about me, I suppose, at this point in my career was that I sort of saw this lost opportunity, right, Jeff? I am a guy that works in every medium, and I see how much is left on the table by people that don't build projects that are intended to be built across media. And I think that's such a shame, you know. But I have had interactions with massive publishers, and there's one in particular I'm thinking of, so I won't name them, but this sort of thing that I think people should be a bit frustrated with, that certainly frustrates me. Talking with them about doing a project, and this is a project that, because I have Like I directed Ninja Turtles animation for Nickelodeon last year. I do film stuff. I do video games. I do animation. I came out with a novel last year. I do all these different things across different media. And talking with this company's head of animation, and with an EVP of business development, and gave him this project and said, I think we can develop this in Georgia. I think we got the tax credit. I think we can do all this thing. It could be designed out. And the feedback I got was, like, basically, Paul, two things. You're a genius, and we love this thing, and we would love to do that project. It lives outside of our system, and our system is so difficult. So you sort of drill into this thing, and you say, wait a minute, every single thing so far is a yes, including we love it, we agree with it, we know it has a VR and AR capability, it's kind of designed that way, it builds this thing out. And so at a certain point, I just looked at the animation guy, and I said, okay, you got to tell me, we're not doing this, are we? And he said, honestly, realistically, of course we're not. Because here's the problem. We don't know who owns this internally within our company. Is it animation? Is it VR? So what you're saying is that the massive sort of difficulty of trying to be absorbed into a giant company, and I happen to know, because I've known for many years, that the game development side of that company argues with the film division constantly. They hate each other. Well, what good does it? I don't care. You go ahead and argue, but don't make it be part of our business. And so the function sometimes of this massive dinosaur that can be Hollywood is sort of pointless, and I don't like it, and I don't see the need to mess with it. I think we can do it here. So I was introduced to Governor Deal, and we had the tax credit, and we had the game tax credit, and that was brought about by amazing people like Andrew Greenberg and the head of the Georgia Game Developers Association. And so they had done all this work, and the governor asked me, he knew that I was a big defender of Georgia. Like, tell me, Governor Deal, why we can't do it here. I've already done it here my entire career. I did it with Ninja Turtles in Massachusetts, in Northampton. So you tell me it can't be done outside the system? I'm going to tell you something. Two of the biggest successes were owned by the creators. That would be Star Wars and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Was completely owned and operated by the creators. Yeah. So it can and should be done outside of that system to some extent. So the governor liked it, and he asked me to chair this advisory committee. We did, our time. We put it together. We met very regularly. We came up with our conclusions, and it was written into law, and it helped, move the tax credit forward for games and sunset them a little later and add it into the pot. So there's a lot of game developers here that owe me a beer.
All right. So, all right, one last thing. Alters. This is your new book that you're doing with Aftershock. You're still going right now, right? Issue 8 just came out or is about to come out?
I think 8 is coming out or just came out, yeah.
Yeah. Where did this idea first come from? Because it's a really interesting comic.
You came once again. You remember I told you, the Century was rejected for years, and they finally said yes.
Yeah.
Once I was having success there, I pitched this new thing, and it was ultimately going to be an X-Men type comic. Yeah. And the idea was that we take people in society who are dealing with some form of disadvantage, and we give them a superpower. And what that does is it creates an environment where here's somebody with this sort of disadvantage, right? And here's this hyper advantage. Here's this mega advantage of this superpower. But what is it that happens really? It's just a collision of forces in the middle that's the person, the human being. Because that's what we're writing about, yeah? Mm-hmm. You can then take someone who has a difficulty. You can take someone, we have someone in the books right now who is a shape changer. And he gets his neck broken. And what they tell him is, that's it. You're going to be a quadriplegic for the rest of your life. And, you might change once, but you'll only live for about 6 weeks. And at that point, he realizes, because, you'll hold your form, but then if you change back, it'll kill you. Mm-hmm. And that asks the question of him and us, if you were a quadriplegic and that became your reality, what would you do? Would you live for 6 weeks, able-bodied, if you could, to get your affairs in order? Or would you endure 30 years of difficulty? What would you actually do? By the way, you do not know the answer to that question, and that is only a question. And it's not it's a hypothetical question. No one gets to really live that out.
Mm-hmm.
Taking that problem into a fictional context allows us to actually think about, well, how then would it feel to be a quadriplegic? Because there are plenty of people that have had this happen.
Mm-hmm.
And she did that across different things. We have a woman who's homeless in the current arc, and she cannot feed her children. She lives out the back of a car, but she gets a power that can basically save the world. So what if you can save the world, but you can't feed your 2 kids?
Yeah.
What do you do? And the primary character in the book, and again, this is a book pitched initially about 10 years ago. And Marvel and DC would always say yes, but never do it. And I understand why. They basically said, we just can't do new characters. But she's transgender. And it wasn't, by the way, and again, number one, this wasn't on the transgender bandwagon that I see people on. Number two, it's not my first transgender character. I actually had a transgender character in a book I did called The Agency. Mm-hmm. So her name was Sue. So it's spelled like the Indian nation Sue, And so the idea of her was actually given to me. I wanted to do a transgender character, and I thought this was interesting, but the idea was really given to me by a girl called Liz Liu, who's a fan, and she works for comedies for the Cartoon Network. And she met me at a convention. She said, I got this really good idea for a superhero. And what she is, she's transgender, but she can't really... She has to live in a way that's really hard for her. Her parents do not see her as the gender that she really is. They see her as a sort of birth gender. And so she's having to basically live as like the middle brother or that was, her thing was basically people don't see her the way they should. And then when she goes in character, she can be who she really is. And I said, Liz, can I borrow that? Because I've wanted to do this thing. And I think that's just tremendous. I really, really want to do this. Would you mind? And Liz was totally cool with that. She's like, I just love the character see print. So the idea is that she superhero secret identities is such a metaphor for it anyway. And she's just living as this middle brother of 3. And then when she gets to be who she really is, it's whenever she's not who she really is. She's Chalice, the superhero, but that's not who she is. So it's all about that. And I think what happened is, sort of predictable couple of, very few people, but predictably sort of people upset that a middle-aged heterosexual white guy was writing this character. Mm-hmm. But overwhelmingly, the response from trans community is like, we love you. This is great. And I think, I think we might have actually done it right. None of it was a crusade. None of it. We never did that, Jeff. We never said, this is about trans angst. Instead, she happens that any stuff that deals with the fact that she's trans and she's trying to work out what to do with her family, it gets complicated because she now has a superpower, so she doesn't know how to tell them. And the reason we don't really do trans angst is because any of that is done as the Peter Parker side of her life. In her private life, she's trying to work out what am I going to do. Just like Peter Parker tries to work out how am I going to get home in time for dinner so that Aunt May doesn't realize I'm Super Spider-Man, right?
Yeah.
But when she is Chalice, there's no trans anything. She's Chalice. She just is Chalice. And I think that approach might have been a bit more of a quiet revolution than dealing with transgender issues, which I'm not qualified to particularly deal with.
Yeah. You're just telling it from a character perspective and everything.
Just having her be. Because right now in the new arc, yes, she remains the transgender character that she is. But guess what? I don't think that we've mentioned that once. She happens to be Chalice. Mm-hmm. And most of it's about the woman that she's helping, the homeless woman. So once we get the character to the point where we're not talking about trans stuff anymore, great. Yeah. That makes it's just character.
That she can just be, as you said, yeah.
Well, she just is in the story, and that makes a bit of a difference, I think, than constantly trying to work out about trans angst and difficulty, because at that point, I think it's a bigger story that I'm not as qualified to tell. And so there's our little quiet revolution with Chalice,
Yeah. All right, so before we go, is there anything else coming up down the road? You said you got some comic books, video games, all that stuff. Anything in particular you want to let us know about? Keep an eye out for?
Let's see. There always is, but I just can't remember. I got a new image series that just came out this last week called God Complex, so that's good. And then most of the other stuff that I'm working on is stuff that I probably can't really bring up right now, just because the way the publishers are, like, I wouldn't bring it up just because, that's their marketing dollars. I'm not going to undermine what they do. So it's not that I'm being secretive. It's more like I respect the fact that they have to keep it down.
Yeah. All right. Before we go, you want to tell people where they can find you online and everything? Check you out. Keep up.
So, find me on Facebook because I should be pretty easy. I imagine I don't know how you do that actually, but I suppose you just sort of write Paul Jenkins Comics. And I have a fan page. It's probably the best way because I have another page, but it's filled up. That's how I started on Facebook. With Twitter, it's my Paul Jenkins.
Okay.
Right. And then Tumblr and other stuff. Honestly, man, I've only got time for two.
Yeah.
I'll probably get onto them. Snapchat, Tumblr, all of these. They're great, but I don't have time, man.
I understand, yeah. Well, you're a busy guy, and that's it. I'll take up no more of your time. Thanks for being on the show, Paul. It was a blast. I love talking to you about this stuff. I can listen to you talk about Inhumans and that Captain America and Alters and all this stuff forever, but I'll let you go ahead and go.
All right, thanks, Jeff. See you, man.
See you later. And so there you have it. I had a blast talking to Paul Jenkins. Huge thanks to him for coming on the show. If you'll notice, I did have a little idiot moment where I said he wrote for Judge Dredd, and I was like, where did I get that? And I remembered it when we worked with him back in the day. I think it was shortly after Dredd came out, and him being British, I asked him if he had ever worked on Judge Dredd, what he thought about the movie and stuff like that. And I guess that's how, for some reason, I remember him, something involving him and Dredd, and I don't know why I thought he wrote it, but that was a dumb move on my part. But anyway, definitely check out Paul's new comic, Alters. It's really cool. Check it out. Aftershock Comics. You can get it on, you can get the trade paperback of the first volume, and it's up to issue 8 now. It's on Comixology, all that stuff. Be sure to come back next week where I'll tell the story of how my failed attempt to go to the Thor Ragnarok screening turned into a surprising encounter that would have made my 12-year-old self crap his pants. So, yeah. And that's going to wrap things up for this episode. If you like this episode, please do us a favor and subscribe to The Amazing Nerdiverse on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher app, and leave us a review. This is the most important thing you can do to help us out and help people find this show. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what you liked. Share the show with your friends on social media on Facebook.com/TheAmazingNerdiverse. On Instagram, we are at Amazing Nerdiverse, and on Twitter, I am at Jeff_Grants. Steven is at Steven Tukert, and we are at NerdiversePod. And finally, go to TheAmazingNerdiverse.com for all that and very little more. And until next time, I'm Jeff Grants. Catch you right here next time in The Amazing Nerdiverse. Hit 'em!
And scene.